So you're on your quest to try to make the perfect Glock pistol. Well, you're in luck. This video is going to be your guide into the world of making a very reliable Glock pistol. I hope you watch the end of the video, and if you do, I have a special message for you at the end. Alright, we're going to start out with different parts that I like and ones to stay away from. Then we'll get into what I do to my Glocks, what I exactly do at all my Glocks for defensive use as well as competition use. But let's start off the video talking about the necessary upgrade. That's going to be sights. I just got this Glock 47. I have not upgraded the sights yet, but that's something that's a mandatory upgrade on the Glock. A lot of people always complain, oh, they have plastic sights. Well, if they put on nicer sights, the Glock will cost more. So use that money that you save to put on the sights that you want. If I'm running an optic, I just use the blacked out ameriglo sights because they're cheap and these are just backup sights. I don't need to do some weird fancy co-witness. When I'm shooting with a red dot, I do not even notice the sights because I am not focusing on them. If you want night sights and you're not running an optic or you just want some night sights, truglo, ameriglo, and trijicon are all good to go. I've had experience with all of them, and those are the three companies that I stick with. Now let's talk about slides, especially if you want to put an optic on your slide. If you want an optic on a Glock, you basically have three options. You can get the MOS Glock pistol. You can get an OEM Glock slide and mill that for a specific optic, or you can get an aftermarket Glock slide. And there's a reason I don't have one right here, and that's because I wore it out so much because I shot it too much. My favorite option if I want an optic is just to get the OEM Glock slide milled out by a company like Jaegerworks. If you're on a budget, Boogeyman Custom also does good work and they're reasonably priced. Agency Arms does fantastic work, but they are pretty expensive. So three companies, you know, I like all of them. I do have experience with all of them, but that's my favorite option, is just to get an optic cut on an OEM Glock slide, because the OEM Glock slide will last longer than any aftermarket slide out there. There is not a slide out there that I've come across yet that does have the lifespan of a Glock slide. Understand that people have shot over 100,000 rounds on a Glock before. Obviously, they've changed out things like springs, extractors, stuff like that, but the slide will last. And I've worn out, billet slides or slides machined from stainless. In my experience, after about 10,000 rounds, they start to get a little bit loose in tolerance. Once you get to 15, 20, that's when they get, a little bit loosey-goosey and start to become a little bit unreliable. There's forged slides too. I do like the shadow system slides. I've had great experience with the shadow system slides. I want to put that out there. Not everyone is bad, and I do like the ZEV slides. They have basically the best RMR cut out there, and even Trijicon has commented on the ZEV RMR cut. So that's my favorite aftermarket slide because it has the best RMR cut. Agency also has very good aftermarket slides, and I like those too. But my favorite option is just to get an OEM Glock slide milled out. The MOS slide isn't bad. Just make sure you install it correctly, add Loctite, use the appropriate length screws, very important, and you let it cure. There are some good aftermarket plates and screws out there from C&H Precision, so if you want to be safe about it, feel a little bit better, get the C&H Precision plate and screws and put it on your MOS pistol. Alright guys, we need to have a conversation about springs really quick and understand how they work in the Glock pistol. I know you're probably saying, I know how they work, but just listen to me, trust me. Each of the main springs has more than just the obvious job. The recoil spring, obviously this pushes your slide back into battery, but it's also responsible for cocking your firing pin, because on a striker fire pistol like the Glock, they cock as the slide is closing and going into battery. You can actually feel it right before it goes into battery. Right there, that little resistance is actually your firing pin lug getting behind your cruciform, and the force of the recoil spring is cocking the firing pin. So if you lighten this spring, you can have issues of your slide not going into battery. The firing pin spring is responsible for popping the primer, obviously, but this spring is also what resets your trigger. It's behind that lug, and when you're letting off the trigger, this spring pushes your trigger forward off the shelf of the connector, and you get that click. So if you lighten this spring, you will soften up your reset. The trigger spring, contrary to popular belief, some people use the 6-pound trigger spring because they think it gives them a more forceful reset. It actually does the opposite. It works in the opposite direction. It actually helps pull the trigger to the rear. So when you change it out, your trigger pull will get slightly lighter, but your reset will get a little bit weaker as a result. This is also responsible for when the cam of the slide pushes in the ear of the connector, it pulls up the rear radius of the trigger bar. Just like that. So these springs work in the opposite direction. So if you use a lighter firing pin spring and a heavier trigger spring, these springs will start fighting against each other because you start changing the timing of the pistol as a whole. So for me, for a defensive pistol, I do not change out any of those springs. If I want a steel guide rod for some reason, I will stick with the OEM 17-pound recoil spring. In a Glock 34, sometimes I go down to a 15-pound recoil spring because I've used that recoil spring in a Glock 34 a lot, and it's proven itself to me to be reliable, but I always make sure it's completely reliable, and I've been doing this for a long time, so I feel comfortable doing stuff like that. For a competition pistol, you can do whatever you want. I'll tell you what I do for a competition pistol. If I'm running a Ranger-proof Task Force trigger and a Glock 34, I used to have the Glock 34, but I traded it because someone wanted it so bad and I got a good deal on it. But I would use the Ranger-proof trigger, 15-pound recoil spring, 6-pound trigger spring, and a 4-pound firing pin spring. Keep in mind, it was a competition pistol. It was not a fighting pistol, but it worked for me. It was reliable, but I also did a bunch of tuning up and sort of hand fitting of the parts, so it was reliable. And the regular, Glock pistol for defensive use, I just leave all the springs alone because I can do other things to make the trigger pull better and make the gun better as a whole before I change out the springs. Alright guys, now let's talk about triggers. One of the most popular upgrades over the last 3 years, a little bit more than 3 years, a lot of companies have resorted to manufacturing their own trigger bars or sourcing non-OEM trigger bars. Obviously because Glock parts have been in high demand and they were pretty hard to find, towards the end of 2020, most of, 2021, and even into 2022. It's a little bit better now, but a lot of companies now just manufacture their own trigger bars. A lot of them suck. I do like the Overwatch Precision Gen 3 trigger bar. I haven't tried their Generation 5. I've tried the Apex Gen 5 trigger bar. I do not like it. I have one right here. The reason I have it with no trigger is because I took off the bar and put a Glock OEM trigger bar on it. If you're looking for a trigger and you're new to this kind of stuff, or you've never had an aftermarket trigger, I recommend you go with Overwatch Precision. I like those. They don't push the limits where you need to have modifications done. Some trigger shoes like agency arms or Ranger Proof, which I do like, remove so much pre-travel that your extension right here has to be modified. Material has to be removed or else it would already be partly disengaging that safety. So Overwatch Precision removes just enough where that does not have to be done. So I do recommend them, and they're pretty close to drop-in. No aftermarket trigger or trigger kit is 100% drop-in. They can always use a little bit of fine-tuning, finessing, hand-fitting, definitely some safety checks before they're at 100%. There are some you can drop in and they'll work. I'm just saying, you can always make them better, and safety checks always need to be done. So I want to be clear about that. I do like Ranger Proof and agency arms. I do have one in my pistol, but it does have to be modified, so just keep that in mind. That's why I do recommend Overwatch Precision. I do like the Apex trigger shoes. I just don't like their trigger bars. I've only had 2 of them. but both those ones I did not like. How I get a good trigger is I will just choose the trigger shoe I want and I will put it on an OEM trigger bar. Then I just clean up all of the edges. A lot of people, they will get the Dremel out and they'll polish it, but understand that on the edges that interact with each other, they still have burrs, they're still rough. So you're basically just polishing a rough surface, which does help. It just doesn't help as much as it could. So I will clean up the edges with sandpaper, different grids and tools that I've made for this process actually. And at the end of the day, I can get a Glock, an OEM trigger, everything stock, sub 4 pounds. If I put on a shoe, like a Ranger Proof or even an Overwatch Precision, the larger shoe gives me more leverage so I can more easily break that trigger, because all the shoe does is just limit some pre-travel and give you more leverage to actually pull and break that trigger. It's not going to make a drastic change to the trigger. It will shorten the pull, some of them, not all of them, shorten the pull, some of them shorten the over travel. I really don't like controlling over travel in the trigger shoe. If I want to control over travel, I will use a set screw in the back of the trigger housing. If done right, it's completely reliable. If done wrong, you can just have a loose, set screw in there. So if you know how to do it, it can be a good upgrade. I just don't have it in defensive pistols, but for competition, I definitely do it. Alright guys, now let's talk about the connectors. Some people, they don't want to spend the money on a Glock trigger, an aftermarket trigger, so they'll buy a connector or something like that. My favorite connector for a carry pistol is just the Glock dot connector or Glock factory minus connector that's in the Glock 34s. Have a minus connector in here and the dot connector in here. Believe it or not, back in the day, if you wanted to buy a minus connector by itself that was not in the 34 already, civilians were not allowed to buy it because they thought it made the trigger too light. It really does not make the trigger that light. But yeah, weird story from back in the day. But I have a minus connector in here. In the Generation 5, if you have it in the Generation 5, it's going to be more of a rolling break. In the Gen 4, kind of a snappy break. Similar to the dot connector in the Generation 4, just because of differences in trigger geometry and part geometry. But I've tuned up this trigger with the minus connector, and it is nice. I do like it because it has this, smooth pre-travel. You get to a wall, but then it's like a very, very short rolling break. The reason I like it is because I can go to that wall and take out that little bit of creep and reconfirm my sights, and I know the next fraction of a millimeter I pull the trigger, bam, it's going to break, and it's not going to be a snappy break. It's going to be a very soft pull through break. You could be very accurate with this. Obviously, training is the most part. I can be just as accurate with a snappy dot connector, but I like both. I do like some of the aftermarket connectors. There's some good ones out there. I like the Ghost Edge for the slimline Glocks, the 43, 43X, and 48. If you want a trigger upgrade, get the it's the Ghost Edge. It's just a regular looking connector, but they do have the factory minus connector for the slimline Glocks now. One of these, and it's not a bad connector. So those are my favorite connectors for the slimline Glocks. For the larger Glocks, I just use the dot or the minus. The Z Pro connector is pretty good because the shelf geometry is in between a dot and a minus. So I do like that one actually. The Lone Wolf 3.5 pound connector, that's what I used in my Glock 34, my competition Glock, before I sold it. I like that because it allowed the trigger to break towards the rear. And that means you'll get a shorter reset, because in the Glock, where the trigger breaks is where it's going to reset. Those two things are interconnected, so if you want a very short reset, just keep in mind that's where a trigger is also going to break. But I do like that connector in a competition style pistol, especially a Gen 4. It works very well in the Gen 4 just because of different geometry. So I do like that, especially in the Generation 4. And the Gen 5, Gen 3, it's going to be a little bit more of a rolling break. It's still going to kind of be like that in the Gen 4, but a little bit different. But I do like that connector. The Apex connector is okay. It's actually also made by Lone Wolf. They make it for Apex because most of the connectors on the market, most of them, not all of them, are either made by Ghost or Lone Wolf, ironically. But there are some good ones out there. The Ghost ones are pretty well made. I'll give them that. And they're not too rigid like some of the other ones out there. They still, have a flex to them, which I like. But for the most part, I just use the factory dot or minus connector. Alright, let's talk about what are sometimes labeled as performance parts. And I'm doing air quotes because I'm not being genuine. Billet or machined extractors. Under any circumstance, do not use those unless you're building out a slide and you cannot find an OEM Glock part. But do not change out your Glock extractor for an aftermarket extractor. I've broken them before. They are more brittle than the OEM extractors. Realize just like an AR lower, a billet versus a forged. The forged has a heat treating process in it, or even like a MIMD or a stamped part, heat treated in the process. So they're going to last longer than the billet or machined parts. This will last a long time. I've broken the billet extractors from various companies, and they'll either break at the claw eventually, or this part actually helps retain your firing pin plunger safety. And on the generation 1 through 4, these will kind of spin a little bit, and it'll cut a nice deep half circular cut in your extractor, pretty deep, and it'll eventually break. So do not change out your extractor. I don't care what anyone says. I've broken them before from various companies testing them out. Skeletonized firing pins. I do not change out my firing pin in my Glock. I do like the Zev skeletonized firing pin. I've had a very good experience with that one. If I'm building out a competition style pistol, sometimes I will use that firing pin. But as for a defensive type pistol, I stick with the OEM because it lasts longer. It has a longer lifespan. And if this tip breaks off, you're screwed. Your gun will not fire. If you're in a defensive situation, that could cost you your life, and you'll have a better chance of literally getting a bullet and trying to set it off than actually using your gun with a broken tip. So I'm joking, of course, but you know what I mean. I do not change this out on a defensive pistol. If you have the OZ9 and you have that part, don't change it out. It's a good part. I'm just saying, do not put a different firing pin in your pistol if you're using it for defensive purposes. If it's a competition pistol, do whatever you want. Alright, let's talk about the firing pin plunger safeties. I've used the Apex, the Zev, a few others. They're alright, but if you're upgrading your trigger, even if you're not, triggers with pre-travel that's reduced or even over travel, these can start making contact with each other. Even on an OEM trigger system, these will sometimes make contact with each other. So if you take apart your Glock, you'll probably see a bunch of tiny little dings in it. And on the non-OEM ones, they get dinged up pretty bad to the point where you have to take sandpaper and remove them if you want to keep using that part. So if I want a rounded off firing pin plunger safety, I literally just round off an OEM. I'll tell you how to do it. It's very easy. Get a Dremel or a drill, get some type of bit, and wrap some tape around it so it can hold this while it's spinning. Then take a stone and just go bzzz and round it off. And of course, polish it, sandpaper, so there's no tooling marks or anything in there. But if you want to round one off, you can do that. Just make sure you have an extra one in case you mess up. But for a defensive pistol, I don't really round them off. I will clean them up, but I don't round them off. I just, I take out all the machine marks and kind of soften up the edges a little bit. But as for rounding it off, I don't really round it off completely. Alright guys, we're just going to go over these two Glocks really quick, and I'll just show you the modifications that I do. At minimum, I do the modifications that are on this pistol. Maximum, for defensive use, I do these modifications. Then we'll talk about competition for a sec. At minimum, I do a complete tuning, stoning, processing of all of the internal parts, and you can get a very nice trigger doing so. I have not put on new sights yet because I just got this pistol 2 weeks ago, but I will change out the sights eventually. So at minimum, trigger job, hand fitting, tuning, finessing of all the internals. This is my primary pistol. I do have a Ranger Proof Task Force trigger on here. I do like this trigger, but you need to know how to work the trigger and make it reliable and safe to have a trigger like this. I did stipple it long time ago, one of my earlier jobs. Don't care about stippling. I used to care more about texture, but where I live in Arizona, if it's 110 degrees out, no amount of stippling or texture is going to compensate for having anything short of a death grip on your pistol. So for the most part, I don't stipple guns anymore. If you want to, go ahead. Slide work, so I can accept an optic. I do have front serrations and top serrations. This one does have a window. I know some people are kind of iffy about the windows. I used to shoot Glock 34s a lot. That has one giant window up top. Beretta 92 series, M9 series has basically a giant window up top. I have not had any reliability issues with guns with windows on them. And when I carry this pistol, I get more dust and debris down this little tiny hole than this giant hole right there. But slide works, so I can put on an optic, trigger shoe, and one internal part has been changed. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Right here. The firing pin plunger safety. Not the safety itself, but the actual spring. I put on a reduced power spring because on this trigger there has been material removed from the extension, so there's not as much as there should be anymore. So I put on a reduced power spring so this extension can more easily disengage this safety now. And it does actually make the initial pre-travel and your trigger pull a little bit smoother too. So I did that. That will not affect the reliability or make it unsafe at all. I just put a slightly lighter spring in there. Not going to affect the reliability. And it makes the gun a little bit more efficient because on the Glock Gen 1 through 4, not the 5, but 1 through 4, these two parts will actually sometimes make contact with each other. If you have a Gen 1 through 4 and you take it apart, you can see on the rim of your plunger safety, there will be little dings in it and stuff, and that's from the shelf of your firing pin making contact with the rim. Because if you ever had, if you ever dropped your pistol and theoretically the trigger got pulled, or the striker dropped, this would be what stopped it. So I did put a reduced power spring, but that's the only internal part that has been changed. If I use if I want a competition pistol, this exact trigger used to be in my Glock 34. I had it with this trigger. I had a 15-pound recoil spring, a 4-pound firing pin spring, and a 6-pound trigger spring, and a giant Terran Tactical magwell. Some stippling, slide work, and that's what I ran for competition use. Understand, different spring weights can work differently in different Glocks and with different triggers. So that may not be a formula that works in your Glock, and you may need to do some fine-tuning to get it to work efficiently for competition use. I do not run that pistol for defensive use. But for competition, for the most part, that's all I do. Alright guys, wanted to make a message for all of you guys out there. Recently I got a comment from someone who pointed out that I always talk about people who make fun of others for not having cool gear and being socially accepted. Then he pointed out that I have nice gear like night vision, Gucci pistols. Then he pointed out that I had a really crappy phone. And that's exactly how I afford stuff. Sheep will go out and buy the new $1,000, $1,500 iPhone every single year. Well, I've been using the same $40 Android phone for 4 years. That's how I get my gear. I don't buy nice phones. Don't need, a more efficient way for the government to spy on me. Need a phone though, and this does what I need it to do. So, get your priorities straight. You can't afford nice things. You just gotta manage stuff and, do without other things. Gentlemen, the more you shoot the Glock pistol, the more you're going to realize that you love all of its imperfections. You're going to realize that all of its imperfections are actually perfection. She's a nice pistol. She's not a Gucci race gun. She's not a purse. She's not a fashion statement. She's a fighting pistol. You show your friends your 2011s, but you show your enemies, and especially tyrants, you show them your Glock. Thanks for watching.